His words are not just about his personal experience, but about the broader issues of injustice and inequality that continue to plague society. He speaks about his belief in truth, justice, and fairness, values that have guided him throughout his life. With passion and conviction, he explains how one act of racism, fueled by ignorance and prejudice, sparked a chain reaction that ultimately led to positive change in his community. He acknowledges the pain of the past, but focuses on the hope of the future. "I used to think that a single act of courage could never make a difference," he says, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I've learned that one act, one stand for what's right, can rewrite 1,000 wrongs. It can start a ripple that transforms a community. And that's what we need now. More courage, more action, more truth." The crowd listens intently, their faces filled with admiration and respect. For many, this is a pivotal moment in their lives, a turning point where they realize that standing for justice isn't just a moral imperative. It's a collective responsibility. The black man finishes his speech, and the room falls silent for a moment before the crowd erupts in applause. In that moment, he knows that his fight has just begun. But it is a fight he is no longer facing alone. The community stands with him, ready to build a future where justice and equality are not just ideals, but a reality for all. Final line. "One act of courage can rewrite 1,000 wrongs. It's time we all stand for justice." He faced prejudice every day, from people who assumed he was lazy because of his race, to those who dismissed his ambitions based on his appearance. But his family had always taught him to rise above it. His mother reminded him daily that his worth wasn't defined by how others saw him, but by his actions and his determination to create change. He had faced racism in many forms, from subtle microaggressions to outright discrimination, but his resolve was unshaken. The boy didn't take his work for granted, even though it came with its challenges. As a waiter in a busy upscale restaurant, he was tasked with balancing multiple tables, moving quickly between customers with a focus that surprised many. His youth made some people treat him as though he didn't belong in such a professional setting, but he never let that affect him. He took pride in his job and dreamed of the day he could leave this work behind, knowing that every step he took now was an investment in his future. His family depended on him, and he would continue to work tirelessly for them. Then there was the woman, a regular at the restaurant, sitting comfortably with her friends at a table. She was in her 40s, used to being treated with deference wherever she went. Raised in a world where privilege and entitlement were the norms, the woman carried her biases like a badge of honor. She had been taught to view people through the lens of their status, race, and wealth. Those who didn't fit her narrow view of worthiness were often dismissed, especially those who worked in service roles. To her, people like the young waiter were nothing more than invisible figures whose sole purpose was to cater to her needs. Her attitude towards service workers was often one of superiority. She believed that her success, her wealth, and her position in society made her entitled to special treatment. She never questioned her beliefs because they were reinforced by the environment she'd grown up in. To her, the world was divided into those who deserved respect and those who didn't, often based on race, class, and occupation. Her behavior toward people from marginalized communities, particularly black people, was steeped in ignorance and condescension. She never paused to consider how her actions might affect others, or to reflect on her own biases. As the boy approached her table, carrying a tray with drinks, he could already feel the weight of her dismissiveness. Her eyes briefly scanned him, sizing him up as she always did when a person of color entered her space. With a wave of her hand, she gestured for him to leave. "I don't want to be served by a child," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the air. "Get me someone else, preferably someone who knows what they're doing." The boy, though taken aback by the coldness of her rejection, did not let her words affect him. He turned away silently, refusing to dignify her contempt with a response. Instead, he walked away with quiet dignity, though the sting of her words remained in his heart. He knew this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. Yet he remained focused on his job, determined to provide for his family and work toward the future he dreamed of, undeterred by the small-mindedness of those around him. For the woman, however, the encounter was just another moment in her day, another person who existed to serve her needs without expectation. But, unbeknownst to her, the very person she had so callously dismissed was about to change everything. The young waiter approached the woman's table with his usual polite smile, his movements swift and purposeful, as he carried a tray with a few extra napkins and drinks. He had a quiet confidence in his demeanor despite his age. As an 11-year-old working in an upscale restaurant, he had learned to carry himself with maturity and professionalism. He didn't have time for distractions, and his focus remained on serving customers with care and precision. When he arrived at her table, he was ready to assist in whatever way was needed. But the woman, seated comfortably with her friends, barely looked up. With a dismissive flick of her hand, she gestured at him, clearly irritated. "I don't want a child serving me," she snapped. "I'd prefer to have someone else do it, someone who actually knows what they're doing." Her words were sharp, condescending, and filled with entitlement. She barely glanced at the boy, her focus firmly on the food in front of her. The waiter's heart sank for a moment, but he didn't let her words get to him. He had learned long ago that people like her often had a narrow view of the world, one that was steeped in privilege and bias. His pride was certainly hurt by her dismissal, but he remained calm. With a quiet acknowledgement, he nodded and stepped away. His job was to serve with professionalism, not to argue or take offense. So he continued to do just that, his focus now shifting to the next table. Meanwhile, the woman returned to her meal oblivious to the boy's quiet resilience. She dug into a piece of steak with gusto, eager to continue her lunch with her friends. But as she chewed, her face suddenly twisted in panic. Her throat constricted, her hands flew to her neck, and her face turned an alarming shade of red. She gasped for air, but nothing came. The piece of steak was lodged in her throat, blocking her airway. A sense of urgency spread across the table as her friends screamed for help, their voices laced with panic. The restaurant fell into a stunned silence. The other patrons exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to react. Some hovered near their tables, uncertain whether they should approach or wait for someone to take charge. The young waiter, who had just returned to the back of the restaurant, was already aware of the commotion. His quick reflexes and acute awareness had him turning around almost immediately. He recognized the signs of choking instantly. His mother had taught him basic first aid and the Heimlich maneuver after a similar incident with his younger brother. Despite the earlier rejection, his instincts took over. Without a moment's hesitation, he rushed back toward the woman's table. When he arrived, he saw the woman's friends desperately calling for help, but no one was stepping forward. He moved swiftly to her side, his professionalism now blending with an urgent desire to help. The young waiter's actions were precise, his hands moving with the focus of someone much older. He placed his hands on her abdomen, preparing for the Heimlich maneuver. The tension in the air was thick. The woman's gasps became weaker as her face flushed with desperation. But the young waiter was steady, his mind clear, as he performed the maneuver with practiced skill. With a forceful thrust, the piece of steak dislodged, and the woman sucked in a sharp breath. Her airway finally cleared. She coughed several times, gasping for air before collapsing back into her chair, her hands clutching her chest in a mix of relief and shock. Her face was pale, and she looked up at the young waiter in wide-eyed astonishment. Her earlier arrogance now replaced by a humbling gratitude. I didn't expect," she stammered, her voice shaky as she found her breath again. "Thank you. You saved my life." The waiter, his face calm and composed, nodded silently, his job done. He didn't need words or recognition. His actions had already spoken volumes. He had done what needed to be done, regardless of the woman's earlier rejection. But as he stepped away, he couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere. The woman's friends, who had been so quick to watch her dismiss him, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. The restaurant, which had fallen into a tense silence during the incident, was slowly returning to normal. But for the woman, the weight of her previous words and her assumptions about him lingered. She had underestimated him, and in doing so, she had almost lost her life. As the woman caught her breath and looked at the young waiter, she realized the stark irony of the situation. The very person she had rejected, the one she had deemed unworthy of her attention, was the one who had come through when it mattered most. The woman sat in her chair, still trembling from the near-death experience, her chest heaving as she tried to regain control of her breath. Her friends, who had been watching the entire incident unfold, were now staring at her in silent discomfort. The shock on their faces mirrored the dismay of the woman herself as the weight of her earlier actions began to settle in. At first, they couldn't quite comprehend the irony of what had just occurred. They had seen how quickly she dismissed the young waiter earlier, how she had treated him as insignificant, unworthy of her time, and how her assumptions about him were rooted in prejudice. They had witnessed her brush him aside. After all, he was a child, and a black one at that, and they had stayed silent. But now, as they sat in stunned silence, they realized the devastating misjudgment they had made. One of the friends, a woman who had been the loudest in her approval of the woman's dismissal of the waiter, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. Her eyes kept flicking to the young waiter, who was standing nearby, observing the scene with quiet professionalism. The other friends, too, seemed at a loss, their discomfort mounting with every second. They had all been complicit in dismissing the young boy earlier, and now, in the wake of the momentous act of heroism they had just witnessed, they couldn't shake the shame that had begun to bubble up inside them. The woman, her breathing finally returning to normal, slowly lifted her gaze from the waiter to meet his eyes. What she saw was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of the child she had so easily dismissed, she saw a young man who had acted with remarkable composure and skill under immense pressure. His age and race no longer seemed to matter in the face of what he had done for her. She saw him not as a servant, but as a hero, someone who had saved her life when she had been moments away from suffocating. The gravity of her earlier behavior hit her with a force she had not anticipated. Her prejudice, her assumptions about his worth, the harsh way she had judged him, all of it crumbled in an instant. She felt the sharp sting of shame, and her eyes softened with a mix of embarrassment and regret. The waiter stood still, silently watching as the woman processed her emotions. She had expected to be indifferent or even annoyed at her second encounter with him. But now, faced with the undeniable truth that this young boy had been the difference between life and death, her heart shifted. All at once, she realized how wrong she had been to judge him. She had let the surface of his appearance, his race, his youth, define him in her mind without ever considering the person beneath. She could feel her face flush with the humiliation of her earlier behavior. She had let her biases cloud her judgment, and now it was clear to her just how dangerous that had been. She couldn't change what had already happened, but in that moment she understood something far deeper than what any social status or privilege could teach her. She understood that human beings should never be judged by the color of their skin, their age, or their place in society. She had learned that lesson the hard way, but it was a lesson she would never forget. With her voice shaky but sincere, the woman looked at the waiter and finally spoke. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I was wrong to judge you." Her words were hesitant, but she knew they were the right ones to say. The young waiter nodded simply, his face still calm. "There's no need for an apology," he said quietly. "I was just doing my job." His response was humble, as though the weight of the situation didn't faze him in the slightest. To him, saving her life was an instinct, something he had done because it was the right thing to do. But for the woman, it was a revelation. The woman's friends, still sitting in stunned silence, began to stir, murmuring quietly among themselves. They exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the realization that they had supported her earlier prejudice. They, too, without saying it aloud, had begun to understand the severity of their complicity in the situation. The woman took a deep breath, trying to gather herself. She had spent so much of her life believing she was superior, believing that people like him were not worthy of her respect. But today, in this very restaurant, everything had changed, and she knew now that it was time to change her thinking and her actions moving forward. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Let us know in the comments. The woman, now fully aware of the magnitude of her earlier actions, stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on the words that had just passed between her and the young waiter. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she felt the weight of her prejudice pressing down on her chest. How could she have been so wrong? How could she have assumed that someone's worth was defined by their race, their age, or their social status? With a deep breath, she finally spoke, her voice shaky but genuine. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking directly at the waiter. "I was wrong to treat you the way I did. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I assumed that because you were a child, and because of your race, you weren't capable of doing your job. I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry." The young waiter met her gaze with a quiet grace. His face was calm, unaffected by the apology, but there was a faint, knowing glimmer in his eyes. He had heard these words of regret before, but somehow this moment felt different. Maybe it was because he had saved her life. Maybe it was because she had genuinely understood the error of her ways. "There's no need to apologize," he replied, his voice steady and dignified. "Respect should come first, no matter who someone is or where they come from. That's all anyone deserves." His response was simple, but it carried weight. He had just saved her life, and yet he didn't seek praise or sympathy. He didn't demand recognition for his heroism. Instead, He reminded her of a basic truth. Respect is a fundamental part of being human, and it should be extended to everyone, regardless of their background. The manager, who had been standing nearby, overheard the exchange and walked over to the table. He had been watching the scene unfold from a distance, and now he saw an opportunity to show true leadership. He approached the waiter and offered him a warm smile. "Young man," the manager said, his tone full of admiration, "I want to thank you for what you did today. You acted quickly, professionally, and without hesitation. You saved a life, and that's something to be proud of." The manager turned to the woman, giving her a moment to gather herself. "I also want to let you know that we're going to reward your actions. Starting today, you'll receive a raise for your dedication and bravery. You deserve it." The waiter smiled slightly, grateful but humble. "Thank you, sir. But I was just doing my job." The manager nodded, recognizing the young waiter's humility. "You did more than your job today. You showed what it truly means to be a professional, to act with courage, and to treat people with respect. That's why you deserve this raise." As the woman listened to the conversation, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was the first time in a long while that she had witnessed someone truly being recognized for their worth based on their actions, rather than their race, age, or social status. The young waiter had proven, in the most profound way, that respect and dignity shouldn't depend on who someone is or where they come from. The woman, now fully humbled and chastened, turned back to the waiter. "Thank you again," she said quietly. "I'll never forget what you've taught me today." With that, she stood up, leaving a generous tip for the young waiter, and made her way toward the door. As she stepped outside, she realized that she had just taken the first step toward changing her perspective, toward seeing people not for the labels she had placed on them, but for the humanity they shared. The waiter, despite his young age, continues his shift with an unshakable sense of pride. His professionalism, maturity, and quick thinking in a life-threatening situation have earned him newfound respect. The once dismissing woman now sees him not as a child or a mere service worker, but as a capable, responsible individual. As he moves between tables, there's a new air of recognition in the restaurant. His colleagues smile at him with respect, the manager nodding in acknowledgement. The woman, though no longer present, has left behind a subtle yet significant shift in the atmosphere. In the days that follow, the woman's perspective continues to evolve. Having learned the lesson of her actions, she speaks publicly about her experience, opening up about her past prejudices and how she learned to view people with a more open heart. She advocates for better treatment of service workers, speaking out about their struggles, especially those from marginalized communities who often go unnoticed or unappreciated. Her change of heart becomes part of a larger movement within her circle, a testament to the ripple effect that a single moment of self-awareness can have on an individual and the people around them. She becomes more vocal about fairness, using her privilege to address systemic inequalities. What began as a moment of intense personal growth becomes part of a broader commitment to promoting respect and dignity for everyone, regardless of background or profession. Her newfound advocacy serves as a reminder that everyone has the power to challenge their biases and make a meaningful impact, even in small, everyday actions. For the young waiter, his actions are a testament to the fact that age, race, or background don't define one's ability to make a difference. He continues to approach his work with the same dedication as before, But now there's a quiet confidence in him that wasn't there before. His heroic deed not only saved a life, but changed the course of his own. He is no longer just a child serving tables. He's someone who showed the power of kindness, professionalism, and bravery. The restaurant's environment shifts too, becoming more inclusive and respectful toward all its workers. Colleagues now ask for his advice and opinions, seeing him as someone who can inspire others. In a particularly poignant moment, the waiter exchanges a respectful glance with the woman during a brief encounter. She nods her head in silent acknowledgement, and he returns the gesture with a small, knowing smile. It's a moment of mutual respect, one that encapsulates the power of change in just a few short hours. The final scene captures him, still young, but now filled with a sense of purpose. He works diligently alongside his peers, knowing that one act of bravery can transcend the role he once thought defined him. His growth as an individual is evident, and he's become more than just a waiter. He's a symbol of resilience, strength, and the quiet force of kindness. As the camera pulls back, the final line echoes in the background. One act of kindness and bravery can change more than just the moment. It can change a heart. The restaurant hums with the energy of this new truth, a place now defined by respect and the promise of positive change.